switched back on. It's now back on. Thank you. Right, agenda item 7. This is the Independent External Assurance Reports Action Plan to respond to the findings and recommendations. Chief Executive findings, recommendations and presentation of action plan. So at this point now, I'll hand over to our Chief Executive, Karen Jones, to summarise and present the action plan. And I'm sure if Rod Alcott and Jack Straw wish to join in with any summaries, then they'll be welcome to do so. So first, I'll pass over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Chair. Just wonder, for the benefit of anybody who is looking into the meeting at this point, whether Rod might want to just give a general overview of what the conclusions were that came out of the report, because we've discussed that briefly in the private section. I think it would be helpful if the overall findings and conclusions were summarised before I go through the detail.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Yes, that would be good, Rod. And remembering that this part now is back onto being recorded, so it would be available for members and other members of the public to listen to.
Thank you, Chair. Happy to just give a quick summary overview of what Jack and I were tasked with doing with these reviews. I think it's important to make the point from the outset that we were asked to look at the governance systems that were operating at the time. We were not looking at conduct issues. That was not part of our remit. We were there to look at the governance issues. And in order to do that, there was some basic questions that we had to ask of these different scenarios. Were there governance processes in place, and were they followed? And across the 3 reports, School Reorganization, Alta Greek Cemetery Road, Kevin Coyd Museum, our findings were that yes, there were governance processes in place, and yes, they were followed. The next question you then have to ask is, were there any flaws in the processes? And the answer across all 3, once again, was yes, there were some flaws in the processes that we have highlighted in the reports. If there are flaws, then it's incumbent upon us to try to suggest how those flaws could be addressed. And we've tried to do that in a series of recommendations that we've attached to each report. I think in summary, what we would say is that what we found were flaws and not failures. And in governance terms, there's quite a significant difference. There wasn't a failure of governance. There were flaws in the governance systems and processes which can now be addressed, and I'm sure the Chief Executive will have the opportunity then to say how these are going to be addressed. I think it's also worthy of mention that based on extensive experience across councils in Wales, finding flaws in governance processes when you undertake reviews of this nature is not unexpected. If you conducted reviews of this type across councils, it's not unexpected that you identify some flaws and some areas for future improvement. If there's a theme to what we uncovered in terms of flaws, it is around the recording of decision making. And that is important because good governance requires that decisions are both informed and transparent. And in the absence of documentary recording of decisions, you cannot be assured and you cannot provide assurance to the public that the decision was well informed. And if there's no documentary evidence, then it's not transparent. So I think it is important that the council learns from this and addresses that issue of transparency through recording of decisions. And that is the theme across the 3. But I would reiterate, what we found were flaws, not systemic governance failure. And there's a huge difference, believe you me, between those. That's my summary, Chair.
Thank you very much, Rod. I take it, Jack, you've nothing to add to that at this moment?
No, nothing to add. Very clear.
Thank you. There we are. I'll pass back to our Chief Executive Officer, then Karen Jones. Karen, do you want to go on with the plan?
Yes, thank you, Chair. If I can take members then to page 19 of the report, because that's where the action plan starts. And again, if there's anybody listening in from outside of the council, what you've got on the left-hand side of the table there is a copy of the recommendations that have been made by the external reviewers. And then alongside that, in the column headed actions, those are the actions that I've either taken already or are intending to take. There's a column then which says who's going to be responsible and accountable for doing that work, and a timescale within which I would expect that work to be completed. So if we deal with Alter Greek Cemetery and the Highways and Engineering Works programme, which is the process that underpins the issue that we've been talking about this morning, the Director of Finance and Corporate Services will be revising the decision-making processes around our capital works programmes. So it's written down and clear how we prioritise one scheme above others. And that will then be regularly tested by the Internal Audit Service. And that in turn will mean that the Governance and Audit Committee will be able to take a regular assurance that we are operating in accordance with the revised processes that the Director of Finance will be developing for me by the 30th of September. The role then of the Capital Programme Steering Group, which is item 2 underneath that, the terms of reference have already been drafted and they need to come forward for us to consider and sign off. And as part of that, we'll be making sure that the points that have been made by the reviewers about recording decisions appropriately are incorporated. I think it's fair to say the CPSG, Capital Programme Steering Group, does have notes of its meetings, but what it didn't have was a comprehensive minute which explained what decision had been taken, but why it had been taken and what had been considered in arriving at that decision. So it wasn't that there was no records, it's just that the records were inadequate. And so we'll be making clear in the new terms of reference that a fuller minute of those meetings is required, and that Capital Programme Steering Group then in turn needs to report somewhere regularly, and the new arrangements will set that out quite clearly. In terms of the fifth point then, that the reports be sent on to the Ombudsman, I have made the reports available to both Public Services Ombudsman and the Auditor General. So right from the start of this, I've been open with those two agencies, but also with South Wales Police as well, because I wanted us to be very clear that we were happy for people to look in at what we were doing, and to also make sure that we weren't crossing over with other people's responsibilities. And in the final column then, the action plan, Chair, I've given you a note of the feedback that I've had from the Auditor General, so you can be clear about what his response was. Moving down the table then to number 6, which is where the recommendations in relation to school reorganisation start. You will see again there's a recommendation there around the recording of meetings and decision-making processes. So the actions that I've already taken there is we have a briefing meeting prior to Cabinet meetings, and we now have written terms of reference for that meeting, so it's clear what that meeting is and how that meeting is recorded. It hasn't been presented to Cabinet yet, and I'll be intending to do so in the next couple of weeks. And to support that, we will be putting in place refresher training for officers and for not just members of the executive, but all members. So we're all clear about the respective roles and responsibilities of officers and members, and some of the learning from this review around recording, use of language, and so on and so forth. So Craig, I know, has already got some people lined up to deliver that training, but we want to give that a priority. We'll be looking to move on that very, very quickly. The other point then that came up in the private section about the options appraisal around the risk of the spoil at the back of Godra Graig not having been done at the time this review was commissioned. I've addressed that because there was a report to the Streetscene and Engineering Cabinet Board on the 21st of May where we've commissioned specialist civil engineering advice on those options, and once that report is received, Chair, we'll go back to that Cabinet Board for a decision to be taken then about what the next course of action will be in relation to that particular site. So I picked that particular issue up, and as I say, that's already been actioned. And then finally, in respect of Kevin Coyd, which was the third issue specifically that the review looked at, Again, a lot of the learning and the recommendations from that will be covered by the officer and member refresher training. But just so that there was no confusion about what had happened at Cefn Coed, again, you had a comprehensive position statement considered by the joint meeting of the Cabinet, Regeneration and Sustainable Development and the Education, Skills and Culture Scrutiny Committees on the 2nd of June 2021. I think we took about 2.5 hours from memory to give members an opportunity to ask questions about exactly what had happened around the grant income that had been secured for the site and why it wasn't possible to progress with the original scheme of works there. So I hope that all members and members of the public are now clear about what's happened there. And as members will know, we've set up a steering group now under the chairmanship of the Director of Education, Leisure and Lifelong Learning to think about what other proposals we can bring forward in respect of Cefn Coed. And again, in all three of cases here, the documentation that Rod and Jack have generated have been shared with both the Public Services Ombudsman and the Auditor General. I did ask Jack and Rod to look at member-officer relationships, and you can see from their report that they've concluded that the protocol is sound. What we need to make sure there's a good understanding of it so that we can demonstrate that we are working to that protocol in practice, and that will be covered in the refresher training that I've already mentioned, Chair. The Auditor General did suggest to me that the Internal Audit Service make provision within their internal audit programme to test some of the new arrangements we're putting in place. I've spoken with Hugh and Anne-Marie this week, and I know that they've got that in hand, so I'm sure that they'll be able to speak to you in due course about the detail of what that work will look like. And I think, Chair, that probably takes you through the entirety of the actions I've already taken and the actions to be completed. And I think just to finish really with an assurance that you will have a progress report on how these actions have progressed, but you will also have the comfort and the support of the Internal Audit Service going forward to periodically test some of these processes we've been talking about this morning, and that will automatically come back to you then through the Internal Audit Service. You can take an ongoing assurance about the way in which these arrangements are working in practice. So I'm happy to take any questions on the action plan, Chair, but hopefully it's clear from what I've said as to what's been done and what needs to be completed.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. Thank you. I have one hand up at the minute. That's Joanna Jenkins, lay member. Jo.
Thank you, Karen, for presenting the action plan. I've just got one question that falls out of the last part you said about our being able to take reassurance about progress being made. You mentioned that the audit process would test the procedures. I'm just wondering how that what will that look like in reality? How can it be tested, and how frequently will it be tested?
Thank you, Jo.
We can hear you, Karen.
Can you?
Are you going back and forth into mute and out of mute? Try now. Try now.
Can you hear me now, Chair?
Yes. Yes, we're okay
Sorry,
now.
I don't know. My machine's having a funny 5 minutes, I think. Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jo. What I've discussed with Hugh and with Anne-Marie is that they will, Anne-Marie will be able to have an input first of all to the way in which we are proposing to change the current arrangements, so she can comment and challenge and test the changes before we put them into place, if that makes sense. And I know that we would ordinarily as well probably talk to our external Audit Wales colleagues, because there's no point in progressing with revised processes that have other flaws in them. So I think that would be the first point I would make, is that we'll involve our audit colleagues in looking at the changes we're proposing to make before we implement them. Anne-Marie and Hugh will probably be able to give you a better account of how it will actually work in practice. But what I would expect is that after we've given the changes some time to bed in, they would typically take a number of transactions and test them against the processes to check that we are working in accordance with the processes that we've designed, and they would then develop a report, as they do with all their other audit work, which would then tell you what the findings are, and if there are any further recommendations that need to be made coming out of that audit work, that would then be expressed in the audit reports that you see at committee. So that's what I would expect generally, but I can see Anne-Marie's got her hand up, so she probably will be able to elaborate on that, I think, Jo.
Thanks, Karen. I'll call in Anne-Marie now then. Anne-Marie?
Yes, I just wanted to sort of flesh out a bit what Hugh, Karen and I discussed earlier in the week. I will be involved in reviewing the new protocols going forward and challenging those, because they do need to be measurable. Like all new processes, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, so it will be how do they actually work in practice. So there may well be ongoing adjustments. I also intend, certainly whilst the new processes for the capital programme steering group become embedded, that I will attend those meetings as an observer, just to see exactly what's going on, and to issue any recommendations, any guidance from an audit perspective, and formal reports will be issued. So it will very much be a combination of reviewing the documentation, attending the meetings, issuing reports, recommendations, and it will be a rolling programme.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Okay. I can see Rod has his hand up. Rod, come back in.
Thank you, Chair. Just with my ex-audit hat on, just to say that, I mean, typically what you will end up looking at to a large extent as well will be the issue of consistency. You know, is this decision-making, recording being applied consistently across the council? So one of the key tests will be consistency, and I think one of the other key tests will be proportionality. You know, we don't want to create an industry where people are recording in great depth, you know, issues that are not necessarily that important. You know, there has to be some proportionality within this. So I think, you know, two of the things that you would be looking for would be proportionality, but most particularly consistency. Is this embedded across the organisation?
Thanks, Rod. That's very useful. Thank you. All right. I see no other members indicating. So as we come to the end, or towards the end of this item, then I see colleagues on page 14 and page 15, this committee of ours has 3 recommendations. Can I check with Craig? Are we taking these now? Is this appropriate now that we go with these recommendations?
Indeed, Chair, yes, you can take all of them en masse if you would like to, just for members to obviously proceed then and confirm going forward.
Thank you, Craig. Before I do that, Rod, your hand is still up. Are you coming back to us with anything? Still muted.
Technology is not my strong point, as you obviously learned this morning.
That's all right. So, members, I have 3 recommendations, pages 14 and 15. Craig Griffiths has indicated that we can take them all together. So would someone like to move, please?
I'll move, Chair.
Vice Chair moves. Seconded.
I'll second, Chair.
Thanks. Before I call for the vote or indications, I had a hand up from Joanna Jenkins. Anything procedural, Joe? It's gone down now.
No, I was just seconding the motion.
Oh, right. Thank you. There we are. I'll take that hand as being that. All right. So we now have the recommendations to take. I don't see any objections or any hands up to query. So in a rule that that's been passed. So we now have the recommendations passed by this Governance and Audit Committee. So thank you very much, everyone. Before I actually close this item, once again, please want to thank on committee's behalf Rod Alcott and Jack Straw for their work and for being with us and presenting today. And of course to our own Chief Executive, Karen Jones, and her team. Thank you very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr.
Okay, thank you.
Croeso.
Diolch. We note that agenda item 8 is a short adjournment of the meeting. So because we have now the regular items coming up, I'm going to adjourn just for 5 or 6 minutes. My laptop tells me it's 12:08. So can we please reconvene at 12:15? Let me just check with Nicola. Do members need to stay in the meeting? Just put themselves on mute. Put yourselves on mute, camera off, whatever you want. This is a comfort break only. Are we coming back? I'll recommence at 12:15. That's all right. Diolch yn fawr.